Yesterday, Statistics Canada released a dataset that largely escaped notice in Washington. Yet it maps a profound shift in North American geopolitical power. While American political discourse remained focused on domestic gasoline prices, Ottawa confirmed that Canadian oil and gas export revenue quietly surpassed $150 billion. This represents not a projection, but a finalized accounting of a massive realized transfer of economic energy southward, an event for which the United States appeared strategically unprepared. This accumulation of capital is a direct result of a multi-decade dependency that is only now being quantified in full. Historically, this bilateral energy relationship operated under an assumption of American exclusivity, a continental arrangement where Canadian resources flowed unfailingly to U.S. markets. In 2024, that dynamic reached a peak, with Canada responsible for 62% of all U.S. crude oil imports, shipping 3.93 million barrels daily southward. That volume is functionally irreplaceable. The combined outputs of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Mexico cannot match what Canada delivers to U.S. refineries every single day. This sequence of high volume and consistent demand created the baseline for the revenue surge that is now reshaping Canada's fiscal toolkit. The specific trigger for this shift was the completion of the Trans Mountain Expansion project, which officially came online in May of 2024. By tripling Canada's capacity to ship crude oil to the Pacific coast, jumping from 300,000 to 890,000 barrels per day, this $34 billion infrastructure commitment fundamentally altered Canada's leverage. For decades, Canadian producers were forced to accept a significant discount, with Western Canadian Select often pricing over $25 per barrel below West Texas Intermediate because the oil had nowhere else to go. The activation of Trans Mountain immediately narrowed that differential to just $9.95 per barrel, generating an estimated $4 billion in additional annual revenue from the exact same production volume. This development demonstrates that strategic infrastructure, not just resource abundance, dictates geopolitical leverage. This new optionality immediately attracted non-American buyers, with China's advanced refineries purchasing Canadian crude directly from the Port of Vancouver. In 2025, Trans Mountain exports from Vancouver grew 95% year-over-year, establishing a mutually beneficial relationship. Canada secured better global pricing, while China secured a stable, heavy crude supply. While this diversification occurred, the structural dependency of the U.S. refining sector remained unchanged, leaving it exposed to this new competition. The integration of Canadian supply is so absolute that in the American Midwest, an area defined as PADD2, 100% of all foreign crude imports originate from Canada. Refineries in states like Illinois, Michigan, and Ohio are physically hardwired to accept Alberta's heavy sour feedstock, which represents 70% of their total daily input, a figure that has doubled in the last decade. The strategic silence from Washington regarding this dependency reveals a distinct lack of any immediate contingency plan for the region. This vulnerability was laid bare in February 2025, when a proposed 25% tariff on Canadian imports was introduced, triggering immediate warnings from the IEA about severe supply disruptions for Midwest refiners. The swift decision to pause that tariff was not a diplomatic concession. It was an explicit acknowledgement of this structural dependency and a tacit admission that America lacks a viable backup plan. Non-Canadian heavy crude alternatives, such as those from Venezuela or the Middle East, are cost-prohibitive for landlocked U.S. refineries due to the insurmountable logistical challenges of tanker and pipeline reversals. What this failed policy maneuver reveals is that for the first time in the modern energy era, Ottawa held quantifiable leverage in a trade negotiation with Washington. Canada is now systematically translating this continental leverage into global financial sovereignty by utilizing the revenue to build multi-generational wealth. This accumulating capital is not being directed into immediate deficits, but is being deliberately saved. Alberta's Heritage Savings Trust Fund hit a record 30 billion Canadian dollars in 2025, with a provincial commitment to reach $250 billion by 2050, explicitly mimicking the sovereign wealth models of resource-disciplined nations like Norway. This financial strategy converts a temporary energy leverage into permanent national power, allowing Canada to transition from a passive resource supplier to an active global energy node. The U.S. refinery system, optimized over 50 years to process heavy Canadian oil, is now forced to compete for the very same barrels that are increasingly feeding Asian markets. The supply map of North America has been redrawn, and the long-term strategic implications are only beginning to surface through the financial data. The pause on American tariffs in early 2025 exposed an unexpected vulnerability. The United States is structurally dependent on Canadian heavy crude, and Ottawa now possesses the infrastructure to redirect its energy gravity toward Asia. This reality has converted a standard trade relationship into a high-stakes geopolitical calculus. While Washington previously assumed that Alberta's oil sands were landlocked and captive, the expansion of the Trans Mountain pipeline proved that structural changes to infrastructure alter continental power dynamics. What follows is an examination of how Canada is systematically codifying this newfound leverage through deliberate domestic policy and long-term capital reallocation. The evidence of this shifting dynamic is embedded in recent diplomatic interactions, most notably the October 2025 White House meeting between newly elected Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and President Donald Trump. Facing aggressive U.S. trade maneuvers, including 50% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, Ottawa did not approach the Oval Office from a position of historical deference. Instead, the Canadian delegation brought a balance sheet showing $188 billion in annual energy exports revenue and a pipeline running at 87% capacity straight to the Pacific. This economic reality recontextualized the entire trade conversation. What that encounter reveals is a fundamental rebalancing of bilateral leverage. Canada was no longer a junior partner requesting market access, but an independent energy power managing to take an essential American supply chain. Al-Majaladith's political confidence is directly tied to the accelerating pace of Canadian infrastructure investment, which continues to outrun American capacity to absorb it. In November 2025, Enbridge announced its Mainline Optimization Phase 1 investment decision, adding 150,000 barrels of daily capacity, specifically to connect Canadian supply to U.S. Gulf Coast refiners, who are actively pleading for expanded access. Simultaneously, however, the southbound mainline system was forced to reject 13% of heavy crude nominations in January 2026 because domestic production growth is systematically outstripping available space. That sequence of events is highly calculated. By expanding American routes while concurrently filling Pacific-bound tankers, Canadian energy conglomerates are using U.S. demand as a hedging mechanism while aggressively building out their primary growth corridors to Asia. The formalization of this dual-track strategy moved from corporate planning to state policy in May 2026, when Prime Minister Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith signed a landmark federal-provincial implementation agreement. This accord establishes a highly synchronized framework to approve an entirely new bitumen pipeline from Alberta to the British Columbia coast by September 2027, specifically engineered to transport an additional 1 million barrels per day to Asian markets. Under the terms, Alberta will submit the comprehensive proposal to the Major Projects Office by July 1, 2026, and Ottawa will formally designate it as a project of national interest under the Building Canada Act by October 1, 2026. This legislative coordination demonstrates an unprecedented level of internal alignment designed to bypass regulatory delays. What this framework does structurally is signal to global markets that Canada's pivot toward China, Japan, and South Korea is no longer a temporary reaction to American tariff threats, but a permanent institutional objective. Williams Lake Tribune, Nisho 3. This massive infrastructure push is backed by an explicit mandate for raw production volume that challenges traditional environmental policy constraints. The May 2026 agreement directly ties the new 1 million barrel Pacific pipeline to a cancellation of the previously proposed federal oil and gas emissions cap, clearing a legislative path for private sector operators to aggressively expand. The state goal is explicitly codified: increased total production from the 2024 record of 5.1 million barrels per day to 6 million barrels by 2030, and ultimately to 8 million barrels per day by 2035. This policy shift indicates a definitive choice by Ottawa to prioritize resource nationalism and export security over absolute domestic carbon limits. For global markets, this means the volume of heavy crude bypassing the United States entirely will soon match the total production capacity of several OPEC members. Williams Lake Tribune to show to ensure this carbon-intensive expansion remains globally competitive in an era of tightening international standards. The Canadian state is deploying its record energy revenues to fund advanced industrial decarbonization. The 2026 agreement locks in massive state and provincial subsidies for the Pathways Alliance project, a multi-billion-dollar initiative designed to capture and sequester 16 million tons of carbon annually from oil sands facilities. By implementing a standardized technology innovation and reduction system that holds carbon pricing at $95 per ton in 2026 before rising to $140 by 2040. The state is providing long-term regulatory certainty for major producers like Cenovus, Suncor, and Imperial. This regulatory architecture is designed to transform Alberta's heavy crude into the lowest emission heavy oil globally. The strategic implication is clear. Canada is engineering a product that can penetrate strictly regulated Asian markets while undermining the long-term viability of higher-emission heavy crudes from Venezuela or the Middle East. Morningstar. Show 2. This accumulation of resource wealth is structurally altering Canada's domestic financial architecture, shifting it away from standard budgetary spending and toward institutional capital preservation. The record gross revenue of $175 billion recorded by the oil sands in 2025 directly fed Alberta's Heritage Savings Trust Fund, which received a $2.8 billion cash injection in July 2025 alone, pushing the fund to an unprecedented $30 billion. A critical legislative amendment enacted in early 2026 now mandates that all investment returns within the fund be automatically reinvested rather than diverted into general provincial revenue. Assuming a 9% annualized compound return, this simple rule change turns the fund into an aggressive wealth engine projected to hit $60 billion by 2033 and surpass $100 billion by 2041. This fiscal discipline represents a direct adaptation of the Norwegian sovereign model, giving a single Canadian province the projected financial capacity to rival the sovereign wealth reserves of major Gulf states by mid-century. The true international intent behind this multi-layered strategy was captured precisely during Prime Minister R. Carney's address to the Economic Club of New York in late May 2026. Standing before an audience of American financial and industrial heavyweights, Carney noted the deep integration of continental energy grids, but dryly observed that his administration is fundamentally focused on what we can control, and that means weaving a dense web of international partnerships abroad. What that response reveals is a deliberate choice to gently but firmly decouple Canada's economic destiny from exclusive American oversight. It is an explicit declaration that while Canada remains a willing trading partner with the United States, it will no longer allow its single largest asset class to be managed or priced by domestic political shifts in Washington. CTV News. This entire continental realignment now converges on a single highly sensitive checkpoint that will dictate the near-term timeline of the energy pivot. By July 1, 2026, Alberta must officially submit its technical and environmental applications for the new 1 million barrel per day Northwest Coast Pipeline to the Federal Major Projects Office. The critical, unresolved question facing both Ottawa and international investors is whether the federal government can successfully navigate its strict constitutional duty to consult Indigenous communities along the proposed British Columbia routes before the October 1, 2026 designation deadline. The outcome of this specific domestic regulatory process will determine whether Canada can legally break ground by September 2027, or whether Washington will gain a temporary reprieve to figure out how to rewire its own landlocked, dependent refiners before the supply shuts off permanently. The intricate layers of policy synchronization, infrastructure expansion, and wealth accumulation detailed previously point to a singular conclusion. The continental energy relationship that defined North American economics for half a century has officially ended. What began as a local debate over retail gasoline prices has evolved into a structural reordering of resource gravity. This transition is not speculative. It is a fully funded, logistically active realignment that fundamentally alters how both state and market actors must operate across the globe. By actively constructing a dual-track export network, Canada has successfully uncoupled its economic survival from a single sovereign buyer, transforming a condition of captive vulnerability into a posture of permanent continental leverage. For the key actors involved, this structural shift carries vastly different strategic implications. For Canada, the primary outcome is the acquisition of structural pricing power and multi-generational fiscal sovereignty, insulated from American political cycles by a compounding wealth fund and direct access to liquid global markets. For the United States, the reality is an enduring, hardwired structural dependency that leaves its largest refining complex permanently exposed to external competition and margin compression. For Europe and the wider Indo-Pacific region, including growing economies like India and established hubs like Japan, Canada is emerging as a critical politically stable alternative to traditional volatile energy suppliers. European buyers are already leveraging this new landscape, as demonstrated by Germany's historic May 2026 long-term supply agreement to import 1 million tons of low-carbon Canadian liquefied natural gas annually, explicitly bypassing depleted Russian supply chains. The likely next moves across the board will see international refiners competing aggressively to lock in long-term contracts for Canadian output, while Washington is forced to underwrite massive domestic infrastructure expansions simply to preserve its existing baseline assets. The single most important takeaway from this entire geopolitical sequence is that infrastructure, when deployed with deliberate institutional discipline, can fundamentally rewrite the power dynamics between a resource exporter and a global superpower. The assumption that geographic proximity equates to political captivity has been shattered by a single expanded pipeline corridor to the Pacific and a multi-billion-dollar sovereign wealth vault. By ensuring that its primary economic asset can now flow interchangeably to either Shanghai or Chicago, Ottawa has permanently shifted the seat of continental energy negotiations from Washington to the corporate boardrooms of Calgary and the legislative halls of Parliament. The United States no longer dictates the terms of the North American energy equation. It must now learn to compete for them.